Justin Woodbury, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. And we're going to be discussing your remarkable book, Sheltered But Not Protected: Learning to Love, Forgive, and Heal After Emotional and Sexual Abuse. And really, this book is all about your personal story, your experience that you had, and and it's a pretty explicit experience, and so you can be as explicit as you need to be to tell your story. But basically, I'd like to ask you to take us through your story pretty much as it is in the book. Um, Although we're not going to have enough time to do it's not like reading the book, but and I'll sort of maybe ask you some questions or make comments as we go along. Is that a good way to proceed?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, start us out. Start us out. Tell us where you grew up and what the family arrangement was, and we'll get into it that way.
For sure. So I grew up on the west side of Ann Arbor, Michigan, out in the country on a farm. And I, from the time the youngest I can remember, I attended an independent fundamental Baptist church
Let
with
me
my
just
family.
cut in for a moment here, because I'm not sure if you're aware that I lived in Ann Arbor for 6 years. I got my doctorate at the University of Michigan, and so
Okay. Yeah, I did read that you taught there as well, right?
okay, yeah, I did. I taught there.
Yeah.
I taught there, so I was there a long time and have a lot of good feelings about Ann Arbor. So sorry to interrupt your flow. Back to
No,
your
you're
story.
fine. Yeah, no, for sure. So we were brought up in a independent fundamental Baptist church, and I don't regret most of that experience, but my parents became Christians out of the 70s, 60s and 70s hippie movement, and
Uh-huh.
they felt that a lot of regrets that they had could be avoided if they were able to shelter their children, shelter us from, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era.
Yeah,
And so instead of properly educating us on different things like that, they just sheltered us from it. So from an early age, in the pastor of the church as well, from an early age, we were not allowed to watch TV. We were not allowed to listen to the radio. Women were not allowed to wear anything other than long dresses. So very Amish like, but it was a Baptist church.
yeah,
And
that's unusual. I grew up in a part-time in a Pentecostal home.
okay, yep,
My grandparents were Pentecostal, and they also sent me to uh, fundamentalist schools, church type
okay,
schools for my early years and my high school. So I had a lot of exposure to that world, but
yes,
it wasn't as extreme. Also, my parents weren't in it, so so
okay,
I we had a liberal environment at home. So I easily could have gotten sucked into a situation like that if people around me had not been a bit more
yes,
open-minded than you were growing up in.
yeah. So the result was we were sheltered. And the reason I call the book Sheltered But Not Protected is because everything that they tried to shelter us from, I mean, we didn't even associate with other churches. Everything they tried to protect us from out in the world happened right within that sheltered environment within the church. So there was all sorts of, and it was mostly sexual things. So a lot of, there was incest and there was child molestation and all sorts of, hold on just a second. Sorry about that, David. I put it on Do Not Disturb.
Oh yeah,
There was all sorts of,
when you say there was incest and all sorts of other things, where are you talking about? In the church? or out in the world that they were trying to protect you from?
Got it. No, within the church. So church members, fathers molesting their daughters, and church members.
And you must have found out about that much later, right? You didn't know that when
Much
you
like
were growing
so,
up.
exactly. So when I came out with my book, I started just finding out kids that I grew up with reaching out because friends with them on social media, reaching out and telling me their own stories of being abused. And it was, physical abuse, child abuse, and then a lot of child molestation, incest, cousins with cousins, and different things like that. So, and my own story that I write about was when I was 13, my mom's
13.
closest friend. Yes, sir. Uh, she was my mom's closest friend, a married woman of four. She began a somewhat innocent relationship with me where she sought me out at church and she sat with me during church functions. When I was 15, there's a inappropriate interaction I talk about more in my book. And then when I was a junior in high school, so still a minor, she actually uh, called me one day. I was being homeschooled, and she called to talk to my mom. My mom happened to be out of the house, and she proceeded to tell me about this really inappropriate sexual dream that she had about me.
Huh.
And that turned into a really twisted, bizarre sexual abuse type relationship with her for a couple of months.
Now, how old was she? You were 15 or 16 by now. And how
Right.
old was she?
She was in her mid 30s.
Pardon? In her 30s?
She was in her mid 30s. Yes, sir.
Or mid 30s. Okay. Yeah, I'm just remembering that time. And yeah, that because when I was at Michigan, it was definitely during the sort of hippie time that you're talking
Hmm.
about. But I was not aware of what might have been going on in small churches in the area. I do know that, as often happens, the university sometimes the universities are set down in very conservative areas that and there's not much communication between the two worlds, and certainly I wasn't aware of of everything that was going on there. um, so tell us more about this. I assume this was exciting and flattering to be taken into her confidence at one level. What other feelings were going on with you?
Yeah, and you're right. It was exciting and flattery. So, or flattering as a 16, 15, 16, 17-year-old growing boy with hormones who had never dated a girl. And you got to understand in this strict environment, we were taught that if you thought about a girl, it was mental impurity. If
Yeah,
you liked her, it was emotional impurity. And any physical contact was physical impurity. So I wasn't allowed to like, think, or touch a girl. And so I had never done any of that. So
yeah.
when a trusted woman that was friends with my mom and she was a trusted confidant in the church, when she approached me and started flattering me in those ways, it was very attractive to me. And there was never, and I get this question asked a lot, did you ever think that something was wrong with it? Never once, because I trusted her and she was
Uh,
an adult. And
uh,
so,
you know,
but what happened?
we hear so much about it the other way around when
Yes.
males as the main molesters. So, but I guess that's not always the case.
Well, it's not. And it is a lot more than we hear about, though, because males tend not to talk about this kind of a thing. And this is one of the reasons, this is one of my whys as to why I have chosen to make myself vulnerable and tell my stories, because there's a lot of men that this happens to, but they're ashamed to talk about it because
Mhm.
male sexual abuse by a woman has been glamorized. It's looked at
Right.
as the ultimate sexual rite of passage for a boy
Yes.
to have
Yes.
sex with an older woman.
Right.
And that was not my experience at all, where it was ultimate rite of passage. It was a horrible thing and horrible things to me. And it had consequences that lasted for years after that until I found healing. But it isn't talked about a lot. And
And
so,
and how did you event? I don't want to speed us up too much. So, you
sure.
how much? How did you begin to find out that and to feel that it was abuse and that and to have some regret about what was going on?
Yeah, for sure. And if I can just interject real quick, how it kind of ended. Uh, a couple of months into this sexual abuse relationship, she began to conspire to have me help her kill her husband because our
Oh
church did
boy.
not believe in marriage and divorce and remarriage. And so the only way, because in her mind, she was wanting, at least what she said, what she was wanting for us to be together forever. I mean, this was more than, it was just twisted. And so she began to conspire to have me help her kill her husband. And then some other things took place where I just ran away from it and stopped taking her phone calls and stopped answering her pages and different things like that. I had a pager back then. I worked for a landscaping company that I had a pager with. So, uh, long story short, I went to college after that. I graduated from high school, went to college, and the freshman year at college, I went to the pastor of the church to tell him what had happened a few years earlier because I had found out that she had been preying on other young boys in the church as well. And I felt a responsibility to go to my pastor. And so when I went to him, he scored the blame. And so he said I was almost just as much as responsible for this that took place than she was, even though I was a minor. He scored the blame 51% to 49%, with me being the 49 just because I was a minor. And so for years, I blamed myself. I
Yeah.
gave myself just as much blame because of probably even more, because that's what victims do. They blame themselves. And so it actually wasn't until I met my wife in 2010 and I told her the story that she was the first person that said, Justin, you were a victim. There is no blame here. You minors cannot give consent. And that
Yeah.
was a completely foreign thing to me. I had never heard,
Wow.
my parents never said that to me. My pastor never said that to me. Nobody had actually said you were a victim until 2010, almost 20 years later.
Wait, what did you major in college? I assume it wasn't something like psychology where you might have heard about this sooner.
Right. Yeah. Good question. So when I graduated from high school, I went to the only college that our church allowed young
Uh,
people to go, and it was actually the pastor's brother-in-law's independent fundamental Baptist college, and I went and studied ministry. So there's zero psychology, zero anything to do with that. It was just an unaccredited college run out of another IFB, or independent fundamental Baptist church. So you're right, I
uh-huh.
didn't learn any of that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. That wasn't till till you shared this with your wife. I'm wondering what other relationships were like for you during the period in which you had not shared this with anyone.
Right. So interestingly enough, I graduated from high school, went to that college, graduated from that college, and went back to the church that I grew up in. That by that time my abuser had left and she was attending another church by then, but I went back to the church I grew up in. And so till I was 29, I was still in that same cultish environment where they believe that mental impurity, emotional impurity, and physical impurity, believe that whole thing. So I didn't really have a girlfriend until I met my wife. I mean, I had off and on relationships, and there's a whole story and a whole book I could have written about one particular relationship, but uh, I didn't really. I was never allowed to date. I was never allowed to go out with a girl. It was, they believed in courtship, and I didn't court anybody, so I wound up It's a long story, but yeah, I didn't really have relationships.
Wow. I'm glad you used the word cultish, because that's what I
Yeah.
was thinking. It has all the earmarks of a cult, of a very closed, insulated world in which it was constructed in a way to really minimize communication with the
Yes.
outside world,
Yes.
and
Yes.
other points of view and so on, which generally
100%.
is what a college experience is about. Is there's You meet people who come from different environments, and you share your experiences, and you learn that, wow, there's a lot of variety out there, but you also, hopefully, you learn a degree of acceptance in rubbing elbows that way.
Yes. Yes.
That's what
100%.
Yeah, that's what it was like for me. So I would assume that for some period of time you were walking around with a word we haven't used here is shame, and it sounds like there would be a lot of shame associated with, you know, this discovery of what you'd been involved in.
Shame is a perfect word. I don't love that word, but I love the distinguishment even between shame and humiliation. I mean, there's definitely shame. I thought I was a bad person for
Yeah,
years. So went to college, came back, worked at the church, but that incident when I was a junior in high school, being sexually abused by my mom's best friend, that incident set me off in a trajectory of other incidences for years until I was about 35. I was in this downward spiral of shame, and I started binge eating, and as a result of trying to deal with the shame, and so I
yeah,
gained about 120 pounds over the next several years until I was, obese and unhealthy, and did not take care of my body and didn't have any self-respect for years, for almost 20 years, until I actually started writing the book and started realizing what happened. But shame's a perfect word to describe it.
yeah. Was it hard for you to write this book? I mean, it's it's so personally revealing, and and the shame that you're talking about, I would think, would have made it extremely challenging. What was it like for you writing the book?
You know, it was difficult writing the book from an objective point of view and from a point of view of forgiveness. So I knew I could have gone in and written the book and just exposed a bunch of people's dirty laundry, because in the book, I not only talk about my own story, but I talk about other people's stories just to prove, just to shed light on the abuse that happens within
Yeah,
religious organizations. There's lots of light shed on the Catholic Church, and I've seen documentaries and everything that talk about, the Mormon Church, but never the Baptist Church. So
right.
I didn't want to just shed I didn't want to just expose dirty laundry or air somebody's dirty laundry. I wanted to be a helpful book, and for people that needed their own healing to be able to read it and experience their own healing. And so I had made the decision early on to write the book in a way in a spirit of forgiveness. And so there were months at a time, especially when I got to the chapter about my own abuse. There were months that went by that I didn't touch the book or didn't touch the chapter or write it because I hadn't learned to forgive, and that was the standard I had set for myself. So writing the book itself was easy. It was actually very uh, therapeutic, and actually getting my story out on
Yeah,
paper.
yeah,
I
I could imagine.
experienced a lot of healing just from doing that. In fact, my goal that I told my wife, my goal is if I can just help one more person heal. And I didn't even realize when I said that to her at the beginning that that person was me. That this writing this book,
Huh.
publishing the book, brought
Yeah.
so much healing. So to answer your question, it wasn't difficult to write. It was difficult to write from a forgiveness point of view, if that makes sense, from a place
Yeah,
of forgiveness.
yeah. And yet that's kind of a sophisticated view. Did you get any psychotherapy during this process?
I did get some. A lot of went to visit different therapists. I don't know if they would have considered it psychotherapy, but I went and visited with sex therapists and I saw marriage counselors, because bringing that kind of baggage into a marriage, you know, in full transparency, when I first got married to my wife, I remember the first time that I kissed my wife. It was when we got engaged, because back then I was still in the Baptist church, and I believe that I needed to wait to do any of that. So
Right.
I would have changed a lot of that now. But when I first kissed her, she was the first person that I had kissed since this whole experience with my abuser, Carolyn. And my abuser was the first person I had ever kissed in my entire life. And so, I talk about in my book, she threw me up against a wall and stuck her tongue down my throat and began kissing me. And that was my first ever experience. And I just remember being horrified at
Yeah.
that
Right.
experience. And so when I went to go kiss my wife for the first time, I was shaking, and she had to calm me down, and I was experiencing all sorts of triggers. But what wound up happening is, when we got married and my wife would make any type of advance towards me sexually, any type of advance, I would push her away, and I would uh, sometimes walk away. I would get angry. I would start shaking. And I remember coming home from work one day, and Emily was waiting for me, and she was wearing something that she thought I would really like. And when I came in the door, she pushed me up against the door and started kissing me, and I pushed her away, and I said, "My God, let me get in the door." And Emily changed out of what she was wearing, and she threw it away, and she went into the bedroom and just sobbed, because she was convinced that I was not attracted to her and that I did not
Yeah.
want her. And it had nothing to do with that. It had
But it,
everything to do with I was being triggered
yeah.
by my experiences. So I had to get marriage counseling as well. To answer your question, I got several types of counseling just to try to get through that and try to understand the difference between my wife showing me sexual advances and being able to distinguish that between her and what had happened when I was 17, 16, 15.
Well, you're a father now, right? You've got kids.
Yes,
I
sir.
assume it got better.
Yes, it did. It did, and it continues to get better. I think a healing is a journey. It's not a one-time incident, and so I continue to heal. But yeah, our marriage today is way different than it was at the very beginning, for sure.
Yeah. 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 What about your wife educationally? She sounded like she was pretty sophisticated when you first shared with her. Had she studied psychology at all, or does she do any kind of human relations work?
So interestingly enough, Emily went to a similar type church, grew up in a similar type environment, but not nearly as cultish as
Uh
mine.
huh. Uh huh.
And she went to a bigger university, and she studied to be an elementary teacher. So she did have classes on psychology, and she even did a stint for a few years in a secular college. And so, and she's just a very practical person too, and she sees things for what they are, and she doesn't spiritualize things like we grew up doing. And so uh, she definitely was the smarter of the two of us when it came to that, in a lot of things. But for sure, I mean, it was just black and white to her. And so I have no doubt that some of that was a result of the education she got.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is your church status now, if I may be so bold as to ask?
Yeah, sure. So one of the best things that have ever happened to me is COVID and being ordered in Colorado to shelter in place.
Really?
Up until that, it was, and I'll tell you why. Up until that point, it was rare that my wife and I would not attend church. So I moved from Michigan to Colorado, immediately joined a Baptist church. We were in that Baptist church for several years until we started noticing it. It wasn't just the Baptist church that I grew up in that was the problem. I was finding the similar problems in other Baptist churches. And so
Uh-huh.
we became aware of a situation of a potential predator in the congregation. And I went to the pastor, and he's like, "Oh man, I will deal with this immediately. He will no longer be working with children." And the next service, he was still working with children. So I went to the pastor and I was like, "What's going on?" He's like, "Well, it's really difficult." And um, until that pastor left, and maybe even today, that guy who was under suspicion of being a predator, he had done things that had really questioned his integrity. As far as I know, he was still working with children. And so it just wasn't that we had to get out of there for
Yeah.
the sake of, when my son was born, I looked down and just realized this immense responsibility that I had to protect him. And that just wasn't going to fly for him. And as it turns out, my son is nonverbal. And so he couldn't even come to us and tell us that something had happened to him, even if he wanted to, because he doesn't talk. He has autism. And so I'm thankful that we got out of that church. But with that being
Yeah.
said, we attended a different church, a non denominational church, all the way up until 2020. We were told to shelter in place, so we couldn't go to church. I got distracted by trying to watch it online, so I just quit watching, quit attending. A couple months later, when Colorado opened back up, I made the decision to not continue to attend church. And so from 2020 until about a month ago, I had not stepped in a church that entire time. And the reason I say it was one of the best things that ever happened to me is because I was able to deconstruct from the way I was brought up and from my religion and really find out what I believed and what I didn't believe. And a lot of it, most of it was what I did not believe. I'm still learning what I believe. So, a long answer to your short question is I still attend church. I still believe in God. I would still call myself a Christian, just not the type of Christian I was brought up believing I was supposed to be,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So we
Yeah.
we just went back to a church like a month ago, and we're trying to get back into it a little bit for our kids' sake too, because for community and stuff like that. So
Right. Right. Um, so you've used the word healing, and, and say more about that, about healing, and how you came to
yeah,
experience healing.
and it's really my favorite thing to talk about, right? Because so many people that I know are still healing. They would call themselves a victim of abuse or maybe a survivor. But I like to think of myself as a thriver after sexual abuse. And simply what I mean about that is, from 17 on until about 37, so about 20 years, like I referenced earlier, my life took a downward spin. I lost all self-respect, lived in shame, had no desire to be a better person, and I blamed it all on my abuse. And my overeating was because of my abuse. When I started writing my book, and then particularly, like I said, the chapter of what happened with Carolyn, my abuser, I I couldn't continue to write it because of the forgiveness part, and I started having nightmares almost every night about what happened when I was 17, and I had nightmares that she would show up at my work or that I was back at the church and everything. And I had gotten to the point where it was destroying my marriage. My wife, like I said, was convinced I didn't love her. It was destroying my work relationships. I wasn't the same at work. And so one day I just cried out, and it was just a cry out to God. And I said, I'm not willing to forgive her, but make me willing. I'm willing to be willing. And
You're willing to be
that
what?
I'm willing to be made willing. Like it's like
Oh,
I was basically like, you've got to do this because I can't do it. I don't have the capability, the capacity within myself to forgive what this woman did. I had these
yeah.
deep, deep hatred and this desire to hurt her and to
Yes.
see her suffer for what she had done. And so I was very bitter, very angry. And justifiably so, but it was destroying me. And so when I cried out like that, it was almost I would say miraculous. The next day, a something had changed, and over time, I noticed that I no longer had these angry feelings, and I was able to continue to write the chapter about what had happened. And I really believe, looking back on that day, that I had a breakthrough and that I truly chose to forgive the right way. And part in my book, I talk about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. I had thought up to that point that to forgive her meant that I had to say it was okay what she did, and it wasn't okay, and it never will be okay. But that's not what forgiveness is. And so I really had to come to grips with what forgiveness truly was for her. But the minute I forgave her, I started to heal.
And
And
take us through that, what forgiveness really is, if it's, if
you
it's
know,
still holding her accountable, but how would you describe it?
yeah, my favorite quote during studying that time was, uh, "To forgive somebody is to let a prisoner free, only to realize that that prisoner was you."
Mhm.
And I
Yeah,
love that
that's
quote because
profound. Yeah, that's a good
yeah,
one.
that's exactly what it was. I thought that I was letting her free, and in reality, I was setting myself free. And so that's really what I experienced, is just a freedom from that.
Yeah, yeah.
Not saying it was okay, not reconciliation either. So whether or not she's sorry and whether or not I forgive her, those are two separate different things. I can't make her be sorry. She couldn't make me forgive her, but I chose forgiveness. I don't know what she's done. As far as I know, she doesn't even think she did anything wrong. Not once has she ever reached out to me and apologized or anything. So
Mhm.
I don't know where that is, but there will never be a reconciliation. Like, I would never sit down with her and talk to her. So that's another thing of what forgiveness is not. I don't have to ever see her again. I don't ever have to think good thoughts about her. She's still a predator as far as I'm concerned, and I've gotten independent verification that that probably is the case. Uh, but that's not my problem anymore. I wrote the book. I've exposed what it is. In fact, in my book, she's the only person that I call out by name, Carolyn. Everyone else in my book, I changed their names because they were innocent. So, but that
Yeah,
forgiveness
you have
started.
another child, right? Not just the boy
I
who's
do.
autistic.
Yes, sir. Yeah. We have a daughter, Juliet, as well.
And how old is she now?
She just turned 7.
Okay.
So, but the healing kind of, it started when I was able to write that chapter, and it kind of came full circle, believe it or not, when I actually published the book and it was out there. And I went to Amazon and I typed in "sheltered but not protected" and I saw it on there. And I started to see some reviews. That kind of put not put an end to my journey. I'm still on a journey, but it set me off in a different direction. And when the book got published, uh, and then I started reading other books, I started really healing and really caring, self care. Whereas before I had no self respect, I started to really respect and care about myself. And I read the Brene Brown book called Daring Greatly. And
Hmm.
that's where she talks about the difference between shame and humiliation. So I started to really understand myself and diving into books. And then I started having this desire. I took my daughter to Disney World for her 6th birthday. And while we were there, I, and I look at pictures and I don't even recognize myself. But while we were there, I had to sit down constantly and my feet were tired because I weighed about 300 pounds. And I just remember getting home after that and falling asleep on the couch one night watching TV, like a week after getting back from Disney World. And then I started to go upstairs to go to bed, and I had to stop to catch my breath on the way up. And I just remember thinking to myself, if I didn't do something about my lack of self-respect for my own body, that I wouldn't be able to see my daughter grow up and get married, or I wouldn't be able to dance with her at her wedding because I would be too out of shape, and it really, really bothered me. And so I determined right then and there to make a change. So in the past year, I've lost almost 100 pounds and have been able to keep it off
Wow, good for you.
because of the healing. Yeah, thank you. But it all started with being able to write the book, getting the counseling, getting the therapy that I needed to, learning to forgive and set myself free. It started with that, and then it just kind of snowballed. And I'm still learning what that looks like too.
Yeah.
Like I said, healing is still a journey. So I'm still finding different ways that I can heal. But it's just been an amazing thing.
It sounds like books have been an important part of that journey. Self-help books, would you say? You mentioned
Yeah,
Benet.
they were. Yeah, Brene Brown. I've read several of her books.
Uh-huh.
I also read. There's a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and that book really helped me understand how to form small habits. So atomic habits, so small incremental changes
Hmm.
over time leading to exponential results. And so when
Yeah.
I actually read that book and understood that all my life I had been more results focused and not process focused, and that why my habits had failed before, that book really set me off in a trajectory that, and it made me just thirst for knowledge and more books. So a lot of self-help books, a lot of healing books, a lot of books on how to build better habits and stuff like that. So
Uh-huh.
this past year has been a year of book reading for me, and I've loved it.
Oh, that's great for me to hear because so many of the people that I interview are authors of what might be uh, called self-help books, and
Okay.
it's possible to kind of get jaded about all that. That many people are writing more or less the same thing, but it's
Mm.
important to hear an inspiring story like yours. How is this affecting um, your work life? What do you see as your vocation? Uh, what is your work and where is it heading?
Yeah. I, this is one of my favorite stories. I think I've probably said that before, but uh, so if I could give you a little bit of background, when I left Ann Arbor, Michigan to move out here, I had left the church that I grew up in, and I had been making $24,000 a year. And when I left the church, you talk about shame. So a part of the story too is I liked the assistant pastor's daughter at the church. Now I was 29 years old, but I got caught with emotional and mental impurity because I thought about the pastor's daughter. I liked her. And so I was brought before the church. I was shamed. I was church disciplined,
Oh,
and I
wow.
lost my job in Ann Arbor at 29. And so the lowest I had ever been was during that time. And I moved from Ann Arbor to Colorado to get away from it all. And I remember driving, it was February 15th of 2010. I was driving to Colorado from Michigan, wondering if I would ever be able to replace that income, that $24,000 a year, and never thought in a million years I would. I got a job at an insurance marketing organization. So it's called an FMO. And I was the marketing assistant. And that was as good. And the starting pay was 35,000 a year. And I was so excited about that. And then the boss, Carlin, who is such an inspiration in my life, he told me, he's like, Justin, if you work for the company, there's no glass ceiling here. If you put the company and you value the company, and you're not just working for the paycheck, but you're working for the company itself. And he told me a Zig Ziglar story that I loved. But he's like, if you do that, there's no glass ceiling here. And so right before publishing the book, but well along into my healing journey, and I had worked myself up to where I was a marketing developer for the company. In 2019, actually the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit the states, the chief marketing officer walked of out of his office, and he never turned around and looked back. He quit. And because I had come so far in my healing journey, my wife said, "You should go after that position. You've earned that. You deserve that." And I'm telling you, a year before, I would have never even considered it. I would have not even had that conversation with Emily. But because I had come so far in my healing and my shame resilience, or whatever Brene Brown calls it, I had come so far in that journey that I decided to go after that position. And so the way the story goes is, in 2010, in February 15th of 2010, I was driving to Colorado wondering if I'd ever replace my my former income of $24,000 a year. On February 15th, 2020, exactly 10 years later, I was named chief marketing officer of the company, and my first year bonus was $24,000 a year.
Wow.
And so the healing and the forgiveness and the thriving, that's why I like to say I
Yeah.
thrive.
Thriving. Yeah.
I'm a thrive after sexual abuse, is because that's the kind of thing, and it's only gotten better from there. I love the team I'm able to lead. It's a privilege to lead the team. Another reason that drove me to read a lot of books was how to be a better manager and a better chief marketing officer. So marketing books as well. But my current state is I'm the chief marketing officer of a large insurance organization, and we support thousands of independent financial advisors all over the country. And I absolutely credit my healing to my ability to do my job and to do it well.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I understand it, then you're helping other people to become independent, financially independent, working with the
Well,
company.
so they're financial advisors, so they're they're helping clients, so retirees, pre-retirees, they're helping them retire smoothly, and they're helping them have sustainable income, because most retirees or pre-retirees have sustainable income with their job. And so these independent financial advisors are helping clients become financially independent after retirement. What I do is I lead a team that helps these financial advisors get in front of their next prospect or client. So you've probably gotten like invitations in the mail to like financial seminars, or you might
Sure.
hear a commercial on the radio of a financial advisor saying, here, help me, come meet with us. We can help you get your money out of the volatile stock market. My team helps design those mailers, the wordings for them, the radio commercials. So we just help independent financial advisors market themselves to their prospects and clients, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So what's your vision for the future?
Man, that's a good question. So next April, or this April, I guess next month, I should say, I am flying down to a place in Ohio, and I'm going to be one of the keynote speakers at an abuse prevention meeting. It'll be my first time I've actually spoken in public about my experience. I mean, I've been on several podcasts, but it'll be my first experience speaking in public. Depending how that goes, I could see myself going in two different directions. One, continuing to be the chief marketing officer here. I love my job, love my team. But I also have this desire to be maybe a motivational speaker, maybe an advocate for male victims of sexual abuse, because like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I think there's a lot more. Well, statistically, I know there's a lot more, but men don't talk about it. And so I don't know if it would be motivational speaking at those types of abuse awareness events, where they can see somebody that did experience sexual abuse but is now thriving, not as a result but in spite of it, thriving in spite of that sexual abuse. So I love getting up and I love motivating people, and I feel like I have a story to tell.
Yeah.
And the 100-pound weight loss and the thriving, I graduated with a fake degree in music, and for someone who graduated from a non-accredited home church college, to be able to say that I'm the chief marketing officer of a large financial organization. I mean, I'm not the richest person in the world, and I'm not, the chief marketing officer of Amazon or anything like that. But uh, depending on how people define success, I would say that I mean, I already know I'm successful because I have a beautiful family. I have a gorgeous wife that loves me, and I have beautiful children that love me, and I love them. So I already consider myself a successful man. But being able to even thrive in the business world in spite of the way I was brought up and the abuse, I think that could be motivating and inspiring to other people. So I don't know what the future holds, but that's definitely something that's on my mind constantly is the ability to be maybe a motivational speaker
Yeah, yeah,
and stuff like that.
yeah. I'm not surprised, and and you've really come a long way, and it is a very inspiring story. So, is there
Thank you.
anything else that we should cover that we haven't here?
I often get asked what my advice would be to somebody who is experiencing any type of abuse, whether it's spousal abuse or mental or emotional or physical abuse. And, in my book, I have a whole chapter on, first you have to get out of your environment. You can't continue to heal if you're still being hurt. And so and I have a whole list of things. But since then, if I had to rewrite the book, I think that I would encourage people that the first step would be recognize that you are in an abusive environment. So many times I've had people reach out to me and say, well, my abuse wasn't really what yours was, but I've experienced this. And people downplay their own abuse because they don't recognize it as abuse. Or I've had
Right.
people say, yeah, my husband beats me, but if I would just learn to stop back talking him, or if I would learn to have food his dinner ready when he gets home, and
Yeah.
they
Right.
blame themselves. And so I guess the advice that I would give to anyone that's experiencing that type of abuse or any type of abuse is to recognize it for what it is and stop making excuses for your abuser, because until you recognize this is abuse, plain and simple, clear cut, until you recognize that, then to me that's the first step. And so that's what I always like to say to people who would ask me, what would you recommend? What advice would you give somebody who is in an abusive environment?
Well, that's a good closing message, I think, for our talk. And it's been a real pleasure to meet you. And you've come a long way, and I can tell you're going to go a lot further, and you're going to be a blessing to people. So, uh, Justin Woodbury, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, Dr. David. I appreciate it.